knights. The badass, steel-enclosed, death-dealing walking tanks of the medieval Europe. I know knights, you know knights, and we all know that all of these medieval warriors exemplified knightlyhood to an unparalleled level. Okay, well, not that.
Son?
Hi.
So, I've decided that anime is not that bad.
Alright, we just gotta say it as it is. Not all knights were created equal. And despite the fact that we know that not all knights are created equal, there's something in our heads that just says, you know, I'm not gonna think of a crap knight when I think of the name knight, right? So here's my plan. We're gonna talk about what makes a knight good, what makes a knight bad, crap, you know. And then, you know, just for kicks, I'm gonna throw in my idea of who is the worst historical knight. And you know what? Maybe this will start a trend. Maybe other people will have to put in their dime in this discussion, because I'd be curious what people think is the worst knight possible in history.
Heaven knows that I'm born too late for these ghosts that I chase. With these dreams I inflate, painted skies in my brain.
First, to answer what makes a knight bad, we must first know what makes a knight good. First is that a knight must pass the Jedi trials. That's not right. This ultimately brings us to the topic of chivalry, a heavily debated thing, and a term that changes throughout the medieval period. Ultimately, to have chivalry is to act in a manner deemed appropriate for a wealthy and originally mounted medieval knight. It was a code of ethics, a way you were expected to act if you were of a nobility. Chivalry found itself in everything if you were a knight. For an obvious example, a knight needed to fight well, but they would only be chivalric if they fought honorably and fairly. This idea extended to how you acted with others in all capacities, to your betters, your underlings, to women, especially with courting, and even to table manners. So, ultimately, to be a good knight was to be rich in chivalry. Therefore, for someone to be truly bad as a knight, while fighting badly would make a portion of it.
On guard. Look out!
Not acting in a chivalric way, especially in the eyes of Christian Europe, was much more important.
One sip,
Bad for me,
one hit,
bad for me,
one kiss.
bad for me. But I give in so easily, and no thank you is how it should have gone. I should stay strong, but I'm weak.
So we said that a bad knight wouldn't act with chivalry, but what exactly does that mean? Could we get a list of things we could look out for spotting a bad knight with?
You bet your sweet bip!
Turns out, yes, we can. I almost certainly am simplifying things, but I've narrowed a bad knight to having showing 5 things. Again, they tend to be opposed to what makes a knight good. We can shorten it down to 3 categories: fighting, social, and since we're dealing with Christian Europe in our case, faith. What we're looking for is someone that checks all of these boxes, or as much as possible. Wait. How do I want to do this? Hey, look! A scientifically and painstakingly organized list of 9 of the most famous knights in history. Successfully transitioning myself to explaining what I'm doing with said list. We're going to be going through everyone on this list and seeing if they're a good knight or a bad one. Pretty simple at the end of the day.
You will know of me, perhaps. William Marshall.
First knight, William Marshall. If you study even a bit of medieval England, then you have likely seen a reference to William Marshall or someone being compared to him. But why? Because he's arguably the bar in knightlyhood. And beyond that, he was a bit of an all-rounder. When he was young, he won several tournaments. He served in the English royal court for a long while with distinction, and was known for both his fairness and strategic know-how on the battlefield. So, was he a bad knight? Far from. the opposite, we could say. Next up, one of the two faces of the Crusades himself, Dick the Cat.
King Richard. I've told you never to mention my brother's name.
So, Richard the Lionheart is one of the most famous figures in history, and luckily for us, he was royal, so he was really
fudging
weird. First, he was the King of England, and his first language was French.
Sing the national anthem!
Allons enfants de...
Besides that, he fought wars with pretty much all of his family members and committed some pretty nutty war crimes in the Holy Land, especially with today's lenses, and was adulterous against his wife and potentially a bisexual. A winning combination in the medieval Catholic Church. Put all that together and you might think he was a bad knight, right? Well, not so fast. Richard is an interesting character for a reason. Firstly, he was a crusading leader, and it seemed he was doing so out of genuine conviction. So much conviction that he negotiated a ceasefire with the Holy Roman Empire and France so they could all go to Saladin-occupied Israel to crusade together. Along with that, Richard showed genuine strategic ability while also being a leading from the front kind of guy and genuinely cared about the well-being of his men. Add all those things up with Richard and where do we get? Well, if you ask people, he's usually a well-liked or a despised kind of guy. That leads me to think that Ricky is a middling figure overall. In terms of knight goodliness, if we were making a tier list, S being perfect knight, F being what we're looking for, Kitty here would be like a low B to C range. Not close to the best, but far from the worst.
I'm Scottish!
William Wallace, the protagonist of the one movie where every Scotsman watching it will scream out,
"This is just wrong." I mean...
Leader and idol of Scottish independence and rebellion against their southerly English neighbors. Honestly, it's difficult to think of a figure more mythologized by a film. Braveheart formed the image of Mel Gibson here so much that he crossed straight into mythology. And when you get into the facts of his life, you're only met by shades of grey. This wasn't helped much by the fact that his time of real influence in history was incredibly small. Wallace's period of historical significance is limited only to his rebellion, which lasted less than 10 years. In the medieval period, pretty small rebellion. What we know about him for sure is that he was bloodthirsty and ruthless in combat and strategically questionable, spending most of his rebellion hiding in caves from the English. Hardly new, and as we saw with Robert the Bruce, in an arguably better sequel on Netflix, that can be effective. Most warfare scholars on this kind of warfare agree that while Wallace was a good face of hit-and-run warfare, he was far away from a master of it. Compare him to a fictional character, you should think of the Mountain in the early seasons of Game of Thrones. Big, very capable fighter, but dishonorable and pretty bad at warfare. The thing is though, Wallace still can't be called a bad knight, because despite him being bloodthirsty, despite him being bad at warfare, and despite him being thoroughly crushed by the English, he always fought for the right reasons. England's King Edward was a dickhead, and was especially a dickhead to the Scottish. In Braveheart, the reasons why they fight are accurate. The wedding scene where that English lord shows up, not gonna speak the rest of it, accurate. The scene where Wallace's wife was killed was tame. Scholars debate if there was an action that happened beforehand, and that starts with the letter R, and the actual death, without giving the details, because those are also disturbing, was way worse. So, despite all the negatives in his life, you can't really say he fought for bad reasons. So putting him down as the worst knight in history, I don't think is possible.
I want to invade España.
Wait, you want to invade Spain?
Sí.
I thought you were Spain.
El Cid, the pain from Spain, and the focus of a lot of literature. El Cid is known first and foremost as a really good fighter. Like Wallace, most of what we know about him is fighting focused. There are aspects about the other parts of his life from post-life literature, but those are historically questionable at best, so his fighting is the most reliable for us. Most people would put El Cid into A or S tier. I'm gonna put him into B. He was overall a good knight, but he changed loyalties like no one else. No one could trust him to hold to vows of allegiance at all. One year he would fight for Spanish Christians, and the next he would fight for Moorish Muslims. And often, even if he was fighting for you at the time, he would straight up ignore your orders if he didn't like them, often causing more problems than he solved. But he did win most of his battles, so worst knight? No.
He has never met an enemy without victory. He has never attacked a town he could not defeat. We're English, Jeff. We know who he is.
Edward the Black Prince, or as I like to call him, that guy with the fur coat and a knight's tale. Honestly, considering that A Knight's Tale is in my top 5 movies, I feel like I should know a lot about the Black Prince, but I don't. Like William Marshall, his name keeps coming up in medieval English history, but honestly, I have no clue why. Like, he's the white bread of medieval figures. Everything about him that's notable is just about war campaigning that was notable, ? Like, his most notable thing was leading the vanguard in the Battle of Crécy, but his dad took care of all the strategy. Besides that, his second most notable thing was that he never became king because he died of dysentery before his father died. Honestly, someone who knows better, comment down below why the Black Prince got so famous, because for the life of me, I can't figure out why, in that context of medieval history, why he's so looked up to. Like, when I look at everything he did, it was the basic, this is what he should be doing kind of experience from a prince like him. Like, he wasn't good or bad at anything. So to me, he just winds up being very average.
He is friendly, Captain. He's good.
Okay, very good, very well.
Bertrand, or Bertrand du Guesclin.
Bertrand du Guesclin.
Not a super well-known guy. He was a commander knight from Brittany during the 100 Years' War fighting for the French, and immediately that's what makes him interesting. You see, in the 100 Years' War, Brittany fought with the English against France. But because the conflict was reopened with the English, Bertrand was in the good for the French king because he quelled assorted rebellions across France. When the war broke out again, Brittany sided with the English, but Bertrand sided with the French king Charles. Like the Black Prince, Bertrand is mainly known for his campaigning, but unlike the Black Prince, why Bertrand gets famous is very clear to me. You see, medieval warfare was known mostly as siege warfare, and for a very good reason, a much, much lower death rate. For most sieges, most people didn't die. They would either submit from a lack of food stores, or see the besieging army give up for lacking stores themselves, or run away from a rescue force. Most, again. Because of this, siege warfare, ironic as it is, was largely safe. Bertrand, in comparison, was known for pitch warfare. Warfare on a field of some kind, lacking any significant buildings. Think Agincourt. This is the riskiest form of warfare, most likely to see a lot of death on the battlefield. Most knights might see 1 or 2 pitch battles and never want to take part in it again. Bertrand here saw 7 and won 5 of them. That might not sound like a lot, but that is a ridiculously high success rate. Again, he's not known for much outside of his fighting. Bit of a trend here, I get that. But the fact is that his fighting should be put on a far higher pedestal. So was he a bad knight? Definitely not.
This girl is on fire!
Joan of Arc, the Maid of Aquitaine, the epitome of preferring your bacon crispy.
Using the oven instead of your stove or microwave not only creates perfectly delicious and crispy bacon.
What Bertrand should be, Joan of Arc is. Now, this is no diss on Joan of Arc, a saint in the Catholic Church and one of the most well-known historical figures, full stop. Joan is one of the few historical figures that might actually deserve the extremely high praises she gets. On our list of what makes a good knight, she fills out most of those categories. She's in our discussion of worst knight, however, for one big reason: the current debate of just how
fudging
nuts she actually was. All of her motivations of fighting were noble. She was both effective and fair in her warfare. All of it stemmed from, and I'm quoting her on this, the voices in her head. Joan of Arc, guys, is straitjacket worthy.
What are you in for? I went a little nuts at the bowling alley.
Ultimately, though, we must take Joan out of the consideration, and annoyingly, for a technicality. Joan wasn't a knight. She was female. Hyper-patriarchal world that medieval Europe was, that was an important enough distinction for them. For us, we're only going to talk about properly knighted knights, which eliminates Joan of Arc from this discussion.
Where be the big dog? Who let the dogs out?
Henry Percy, more well known as Henry Hotspur, a name he got from the Scottish for how willing he was to go to battle. He was known most for fighting against the Scottish with the English King Edward during that time when Wallace and Robert the Bruce were rebelling. With what we talked about with Wallace, you'd think he'd immediately be put right into our contention for worst knight ever, right? Well, not quite. See, of all the nobles that Wallace and the Bruce fought, Hotspur was one of the ones that the Scottish at the time considered the most worthy of respect. Hotspur was the most likely to fight honorably and was openly critical of Edward's imperial policies towards the Scottish. In fact, his disagreements with the English royal family was so high that he withdrew his support of that monarchy and threw in his support for a rebel claimant, a guy named Henry Bolingbroke, eventually being slain in a battle between those two forces. A lot of people would count him betraying the sitting English king as a negative, but with our lens of how bad the English monarchy was at the time, it's a common thought that him supporting the rebels was the more honorable move. Definitely not the worst knight in history.
Monsieur, où est la boulangerie?
Il est là,
Ouais.
200 mètres.
Super. Merci.
Finally, the last on our list of famous knights, we have Geoffroy de Charny, another figure from the 100 Years' War, a very capable fighter and a minorly capable duelist. De Charny was known as a capable and noble fighter and as a potential, though admittedly unlikely, author of the literal Manual of Chivalry, the aptly named Book of Chivalry. Honestly, there's not much I could say about Geoffroy. He was just a good knight. He won't get close to our consideration for worst knight. He's not known for any significant scandals. He was considered worthy of respect by both allies and enemies, and at a time when fidelity to your wife wasn't expected, he was, to the extent where he was hesitant to remarry after her tragic early death. The quiet, competent guy in the background, Geoffroy de Charny, seemed like a pretty good dude. Well, we just went over 9 of the most famous knights in history, and I just gave my reasons why literally none of them can be called the absolute worst. So, where does that leave us? Well, if we're getting nowhere with the conventional famous knights, then I think we need to look outside of the box a bit here. Who could, in some random off chance, actually be a knight, and no one would ever guess it in their, hopefully, same mind? Ladies and gentlemen, I think I found a candidate. And to set the stage, we need to go back and talk about my favorite setting in history.
Pancake is on me head.
It looks like pita bread.
Italy, the land of art, wine, pizza, and speaking with your hands, perhaps the one place in Europe where the relationship with nobility couldn't be more varied across a landscape. Depending on the time and city-state, how nobility was viewed by the common folk, and how that nobility functioned with the larger world could differ by a comically high level. Italy is also a place of wide contradictions, which is actually fitting for the guy we're thinking of. We're going to be talking about a guy called Michael, or in Italian, Michelangelo. Now I know what you're thinking. No, it's not that one. In fact, it's not even that one. Michelangelo was a pretty common name at the time we're thinking of, so the chances of picking out a random Michelangelo from the time and him being one you know would actually be pretty small. There is a chance you know of this one though, but we'll get to that later. So where do we begin? We begin in Milan, northern Italy, 1570s, and that's already an interesting place to start. Remember when I said that Italy had diverse sensibilities to nobility? Big part of that was just how diverse the different powerful cities were. There were 5 reliable power players across the peninsula. Naples, classical kingdom. Rome, the seat of the church that basically functioned as an elected monarchy. Florence, classically a republic but would have turned into a duchy by the Medici family at this point. Venice, also a republic, but had a sort of elected prime minister for life thing going on with the Doge. And finally, Milan, classically, and at this point still, a duchy under the Sforza family, and a particularly militaristic one. Our Michelangelo was born in a small village under the control of this Milan. What does this mean for us? It means that Michelangelo was born in a city with an industry for its military, along with a whole bunch of young men that were simply waiting for the next war to happen. Michelangelo wasn't a knight yet, we'll get to that. So, he was also one of these guys hanging out and waiting for another war to begin. Eventually, Michelangelo had enough of Milan and moved south, first to Florence, and then to get a reliable job in Rome. Oh, by the way, that job was with the church, and not just some small church in the city, no. He worked with the cardinals, a very real possibility. He met with the Pope himself and had conversations with him. It is here that we should switch to Michael's much more well-known name. Caravaggio. If this name isn't familiar, ask your local art teacher. He was a painter of particular note, not quite as famous as Da Vinci or Van Gogh, but still a really well-known one in those snooty art circles. So much so that you've probably seen one of his paintings before without knowing it, and if that is the case, then there's also a good chance you've seen him before, because like a lot of Italian painters, Caravaggio signed his paintings with the method of painting himself as one of the characters in the painting. See this one? This is called Judith Beheading Holofernes. Caravaggio painted himself as Holofernes. What a fun guy. Anywho, Caravaggio's job with the church and others was painting, and the bulk of these were events from the Bible. As such, while he was making those paintings in Rome, naturally he would have lived in the painter's quarter of Rome. Just take a quick second, imagine what that must be like, okay? Cool. Now, throw all that away and then imagine a Renaissance freak combination of Star Wars' Mos Eisley, the Red Light District in Amsterdam, and the gang warfare of nondescript American metropolis.
There's that man walking along playing with his testicles.
Los Angeles. That's basically the artist quarters in Rome here. It blew. Real fat chunks. Smooth transition point, let's go back to our bad night list because we can put grades on our 6 categories now. First off, contrary to my main point, Caravaggio was actually a pretty decent fighter. We'll get to that later. Along with that foreshadowing, we can absolutely say that he was a very dishonorable fighter, so we're still in the good, or bad. The last 4 we can easily answer in this period of Caravaggio's life. The easiest one to answer, him being ungenteel to women, which we can very easily summarize by noting that he was a pimp. Yes, very literally, Caravaggio managed prostitutes. In fact, if we look at these 3 paintings, we can see that all 3 have the same woman in them. This is Leelee, and Leelee was Caravaggio's favorite prostitute, who he both managed and rendered the services of. He got into a lot of trouble with his church bosses with that one. To answer if he was rude, we don't have to go very far. Not only did he heavily drink and made enemies easily, but with the exception of Leelee, he really didn't treat the prostitutes he managed well, on more than one occasion giving a woman he managed a very medieval insult of cutting them across the cheeks to leave a nasty scar. So rude box is safely checked. When it comes to Caravaggio's rebelliousness to superiors, it becomes a bit complicated. He could be a real suck-up if he needed to, but only if he needed to. During his time in Rome, he would get into trouble with the law a lot, and whenever he got into that trouble, he would flaunt his contacts with the church to get out of that trouble, usually with a strong sense of arrogance.
Disrespect the law, and you disrespect me.
I think we can check this box as well, but with like an asterisk or something, because Caravaggio's respect was always given opportunistically first. Caravaggio was also undoubtedly a bad Christian, but this is also a very interesting one, because it seems that he was keenly aware of it. Remember how painting yourself into a painting at this time was a signature? Well, how you painted yourself in would reveal a lot about yourself as a painter and personality. Caravaggio is interesting because he always painted himself as either the antagonist / victim in the story shown, or as what we could call an overly eager observer to these stories, depicting himself as almost self-indulgently curious. It's been interpreted by many art historians as Caravaggio showing that he was aware that he wasn't acting Christian-like in his daily activities, and that he was keenly aware of it. So yeah, Caravaggio was not just a bad Christian, he also knew it very well. Now that all those are finished, we can go back to the two fighting points and continue on with our story, because now we're at the most important part of Caravaggio's life. Remember, we're in the artist's quarters, and despite the name, it was filled with the less than wanted population of Rome. Caravaggio was very well integrated, which at this point in Rome meant only one thing: gangs. Gang warfare in Rome was everywhere at this period, and Caravaggio wasn't just around it, he was an active and willing participant. Remember how he was brought before the law on multiple occasions? Well, most of it was because he would casually assault people. Insult him in the past and happen to walk on the same street? Assault. Did you start managing a prostitute that he used to? Assault. Look at him vaguely the wrong way in a bar? Assault. Were you a rival artist? Assault. So yeah, Caravaggio racked up a mighty impressive record.
Catnip.
That's no mine.
Caravaggio, though, was particularly dangerous on the streets of Rome for two reasons. First, he spent the majority of his childhood in Milan, and Milan not only also had gang warfare, but Milan's gang warfare was often with trained soldiers due to its military history. So Caravaggio was playing gang warfare in Milan with some of the best fighters in Italy. Rome, in comparison, would be pretty easy pickings for him. Point 2 is more important though, and this point is that Caravaggio worked with the church. How is that important, you may ask? Well, it means that Caravaggio got a very special pass. Rome at this period banned swords in the city, taking inspiration from some German city-states to help combat its gang warfare. To carry a sword, you needed special permission, either being a high-ranking noble or having a high enough member of the church vouch for you. Caravaggio, with his church connections through work, managed to get himself one of these passes, which, when he was brought before the law, meant that he couldn't have his sword be taken from him. His sword couldn't be confiscated. All of this would lead to the catalyst of Caravaggio's life. The 28th of May, 1606, a man named Ranuccio Tomassoni, 2 swords, and a tennis court. I mean, if that doesn't sound like a duel, I don't know what does. Now, the background and specifics of what happened in this duel are not known well. We can infer that it was an agreed upon duel with the tennis court as the meeting place, so not a spontaneous event at a random tennis match. What we know is that Caravaggio and Tomassoni had seconds and witnesses. It wound up growing to a more than a duel scuffle. Caravaggio and a couple others were wounded, but Tomassoni would die from a stab wound in his thigh, probably cutting his major artery, and bled out on the court. After this happened, Caravaggio hightailed it out of Rome. He wasn't just in trouble, he was in real trouble. This, amazingly, was the first time Caravaggio killed someone, or at least was caught for it. Naturally pretty bad. But along with that, duels were illegal in Rome, and punishable by death regardless of the circumstances. And despite the violent scuffle that happened after Caravaggio won the duel, some of his opponent's witnesses still lived. His connections with the church wouldn't protect him anymore. Caravaggio needed to get out of Rome yesterday. So, flee he did, and for a time Caravaggio would meander around the Italian peninsula, mainly around the Alban Hills and Naples, and then this guy galaxy-brained to having the best idea ever. Malta. He thinks I'm gonna hightail it over to Malta, nearly 1,000 kilometers away, and hang out
with the Knights of St. John.
Perhaps known by their more famous name, the Knights Hospitaller, a knightly order made famous during the campaigns in Israel by establishing hospitals and protecting pilgrims. Malta was their fortress island home, and if you could join as an accepted member, you could be cleansed of past sins, and potentially have previous charges against you dropped. Caravaggio thought this was a great idea, because 1, he's got a real bad record he wants cleaned up, and 2, he was obsessed with knights due to his upbringing in Milan. It all seemed like a win-win, so Malta he would go. But how to actually join the Hospitaller ranks? The Hospitallers were one of the most highly esteemed knightly orders in the history of Christendom, and they remained highly powerful at the beginning of the 1600s. But this was several hundred years after the peak of the crusading conflicts. They didn't need any more members, let alone one just recently accused of dishonorable murder at the home of the Pope. Caravaggio was swimming against the current to be a member of the order. How the heck could he get in? Luckily for our felon painter, the top commander of Malta at this time was a guy named Wignacourt, and he had the authority to include new members, and he avidly collected paintings. Wignacourt was the Grand Master of the Order, and it was only he who had the power to absolve Caravaggio of his past. So, Caravaggio would spend the next while getting on Wignacourt's good side, finally winning his favor by painting him a very favorable painting portrait, which coincidentally hid an unseeming wart on the left side of his nose. Wignacourt would write to the church in Rome saying he was going to make Caravaggio a novice in the order, getting him his knight status and absolving Caravaggio of his crime. Rome wrote back to Wignacourt telling him of Caravaggio's conviction, but couldn't do anything to change the commander's mind. Michelangelo da Caravaggio was now officially a Knight Hospitaller, a novice of the order. He only had to be well behaved for a year to become a fully fledged member with all the benefits of being one. Briefly. Remember, we're still talking about a worse knight in history. Naturally, Caravaggio was going to mess this up. And he messed it up. Pretty much right after he became a full member. Malta was a military base, with a military base's discipline. Stuff he got away with earlier would not fly here in Malta. Breaking that discipline had heavy punishments. Mere weeks after being inducted into the order, Caravaggio was in prison, after injuring another knight of the order in a fight, one of higher rank, in a large scuffle. To make matters worse, he was thrown in prison a mere day before one of the most important feast days of the order, and news of the fight pretty much ruined the vibe of the feast. Wignacourt was left embarrassed. We don't know the extent of how much trouble he was in, but Caravaggio must have been in enough trouble to actively consider escape from the Malta dungeons. Because he did escape. Again, we don't know how. And is next seen historically in Sicily, likely fleeing the influence of the order. Unlike Rome though, Caravaggio's problems would follow him, and in Naples, at a brothel, he was jumped by several men from Malta in a knife attack. He survived, but he never recovered from the wounds that he got then. And soon afterwards, while traveling, he would eventually succumb to the strain of traveling, the overbearing heat of summer, and that stab wound. Caravaggio died in 1610 at 38. So, there we go. Worst knight in history, Caravaggio. Painter, gangist, pimp, and repeated serial offender. He just might be the worst knight in history.
Totaled my goddamn car.
Back.
You totaled the car.
We're walking back.
You totaled.
We are walking back.
Oh yeah, sure. Here you go. Oh. No.